WABC Chime Time. I just got a call from Georgia. Now, this doesn't mean a heck of a lot, except for the fact that the other night I got a call from Indiana. And the whole thing is about one thing. The fact that there's something very strange about the Beatle Paul. The fact that the Beatle Paul may be dead. In Indiana University, for instance, at Bloomington, there are 30 students working on a research project indicating that the Beatle Paul might be dead. I talked to them last night for an hour and a half. As a DJ on the world's largest radio station, I felt it my business to listen to their claims. And they told me some things which shocked me. And I was up all night last night. And I promised myself.
Musicians truly are the most famous people to walk the earth. If you become big, like truly big, you're no longer viewed as just another musician or another person. You're viewed as a god. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that many musicians have various conspiracy theories attached to them. Can Stevie Wonder actually see? Is Beyonce in the Illuminati? Was Kurt Cobain actually murdered? Is Elvis actually alive? Is Tupac actually alive? Is Biggie actually alive? Okay, this might seem crazy, but sometimes people die. Shocking, I know. However, when it comes to pop music conspiracies, there is probably none more infamous, at least in my opinion, than the one called Paul is Dead. The idea that Paul McCartney, yes, the Paul McCartney, died in a traffic accident in 1966 and was subsequently replaced with a double who still acts as him to this very day. This is the story and the clues behind Paul is Dead.
Well, this is just a prime example of how popular and powerful the Beatles were back in the late 60s.
You know, growing up...
I'll tell you anything.
Okay, growing up, I mean, you've had to deal with a lot of crazy things, including, rumors that your father was dead, remember?
Yes.
You must be aware of this. For a long time, there was a huge rumor, at one point, a conspiracy theory, if you like, that Paul McCartney was dead and that you are not Paul McCartney, you're an imposter pretending to be Paul McCartney. How did this come about?
Found me out.
Just as a heads up, I'm going to try some different lighting techniques with this video. Like some parts, all of this may look entirely red. I don't know if it's going to look great. We'll see how it turns out. Let me know what you think about it and if I should continue with something like that. Or whether it should always just be, this, what I have typically in my videos. Now, usually when I make these type of videos, I'll do a little introduction on the person I'm talking about. However, obviously with this, I feel Paul McCartney really doesn't need an introduction. I mean, it's Paul McCartney, arguably the most famous person from the most famous band in the world. What if I told you this isn't actually Paul McCartney? As a matter of fact, what if I told you that Paul McCartney has been dead for almost 60 years? Now, your head's probably spinning. You're probably like, what? No, Paul McCartney isn't dead. He literally just got done with a huge world tour. Well, that isn't actually Paul McCartney. That is Paul McCartney's double. Various names go around, but the most commonly accepted one is that this is actually a double by the name of William Campbell. Now, I'm sure by now your head's probably spinning. You're probably very confused as to what I'm talking about. Well, don't worry. I'm going to give you a basic rundown on what really happened in 1966. And to do that, I'm going to set some very spooky lighting, so after I clap my hands, there will be a very seamless transition to that using editing magic. You ready? You ready? You ready? Now it's all nice and spooky in here, and I can give you the rundown on what really happened. In late 1966, during a Sgt. Pepper session, Paul would storm out the sessions in a fit of anger. He would then drive home and he would be distracted by someone. Some sources say it was a meter maid, funny enough, where he would then crash his car and get decapitated. And then either as a form of grief, or maybe they just did it for funsies, the Beatles would find a new Paul to replace him. Now, in all seriousness, I think we know that Paul McCartney isn't actually dead. In fact, me explaining it out loud sounded absolutely hilarious, but you'd be surprised as to how many people believed, and still to this day do believe, that Paul McCartney is not Paul McCartney. At the time, it culminated a whole article in Life magazine. But to get to that point, we need to start where all great stories start, at the beginning. The year is 1966, and the Beatles are the most famous people walking the earth. They're constantly in the media, they're constantly doing interviews, constantly doing massive worldwide tours all over the world, until they weren't. Beginning that year, the group would begin to distance themselves from the media. They would be doing less interviews. They wouldn't be making nearly as many TV appearances. They would stop touring altogether, and most importantly, their output began to slow down. Just for a little bit of context, the music landscape today was a lot different than it was back then. You know, nowadays you can have an artist like Kendrick Lamar go 5 years without releasing an album. He releases it, it goes to #1, it sells millions, and he still gets critical acclaim. Wasn't really like that back in the 60s. Back in the 60s, pop artists were expected to drop multiple albums every year, and the Beatles were no exception. From 1963 to 1965, the group released 6 full-length albums. They also had multiple #1 hits that weren't even on the albums, and most importantly, they stopped touring altogether. However, in 1966, things would be significantly different. There would be no feature film, there would be significantly less concerts, and more importantly, they wouldn't release 2 studio albums that year. They would only release 1, that album in question being this one. Nowadays, it's easy to view Revolver as a watershed moment in pop music, but back in the day, a lot of Beatles fans didn't know what to make of this thing. It's almost like it was made by entirely different people, and maybe it was. Because of these strange happenings, a lot of rumors would surface. The most notable one was that the group was on the verge of breaking up, which wouldn't be true at least for another 3 years. Although a more darker one began to emerge, that Paul McCartney was dead, or terminally ill. Now, it wasn't just the general public making up these rumors. Various industry insiders would also begin to fuel the flames. During an engagement party for Paul, there was a journalist named Jay Martz. Now, Jay Martz was allegedly told that Paul had been replaced. Now, there's no proof that he was ever told this, and if he was, we don't know what the full context of that sentence was. But this is a completely trustworthy dude who would never make up anything like that, just as he would never make up being Native American for 20 years. It was around this time that phone calls would trickle into the Beatles press office at the time, a man named Tony Barrow. He would be asked if Paul was dead, and he would reply that he had recently spoken with McCartney, and people would leave it at that, and the rumor would slowly start to fade off. That would be until the release of one of the most influential albums of all time that the rumor would resurface once again. It is now early November 1966, and at this point in the conspiracy, this is where the most agreed upon time of the events happened. On November 6, 1966, during a recording session for the Beatles' seminal Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, Paul would leave in a fit of anger. Now, let's ignore the fact that the Sgt. Peppers didn't even begin until November 24th, but we're gonna ignore that. Paul would have an argument with his bandmates, and he would drive away in a fit of anger. While driving, he would be distracted by a meter maid, where he would crash his car and get himself decapitated. EMI, which was the record label for the group, would not want to lose sales during this thing, so they would want to search for a replacement for McCartney and keep the real McCartney's death under wraps. And when I say replacement, I'm not talking about David Gilmour replacing Syd Barrett. No. They wanted an exact copy. With the participation of the Beatles, they would find a man named William Campbell, aka Billy Shears. Now, ignore the fact that Billy Shears isn't Paul's character on the album, it's Ringo's character, but on to the Sgt. Pepper clues. Now, I don't think I need to do a full in-depth analysis on why Sgt. Pepper is an influential album. I mean, the whole format as we know it probably wouldn't exist without it, but in short, it's pretty good. Although I'd be dead in the ground before I called it a top 3 Beatles record. However, there were a few strange things going on with this record. It's almost like the Beatles were hiding a horrible secret. Let's take a dive in. Now, lyrical-wise with the album, there's not really anything interesting to go into. The only thing I can really think of the top of my head is the track Lovely Rita, which some people think is about the, quote, meter maid that caused Paul to crash, but there's no other connections to it outside of there being a meter maid in the song. Other than that, the only really notable, lyrical reference is on arguably the greatest Beatles songs ever recorded, the closing track, A Day in the Life. In the track, John sings, "He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lord." Now the real fun starts with the actual album art itself. If you place a small little mirror over the middle of the drum on the record, it will read I1IX He Die, which, I can't even lie, that kind of creeped me out the first time I noticed it. Now, one of the most famous clues is actually within the gatefold of the record. If you open the record up, you'll find that Paul is wearing a badge that says OPD, which some people have read as officially pronounced dead. However, a slight problem with that, the badge doesn't say OPD, it says OPP, because the badge was actually from the Ontario Provincial Police. Lastly, for the Sgt. Pepper clues, I would like to direct your attention to the back of the record. If you look, ooh, Paul's facing the other direction, ooh. This clue would actually end up being so famous that it would be referenced in a Batman comic. And that's about it for Sgt. Pepper clues, but we are going to stay in 1967 for a little bit longer. In February, a fan magazine called The Beatles Book would acknowledge and rebut the rumor, where they would state, quote, "Stories about the Beatles are always flying around Fleet Street. The 7th of January was very icy with dangerous conditions on the M1 motorway, linking London with the Midlands. And towards the end of the day, a rumor swept London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. But, of course, there was absolutely no truth in it at all, as the Beatles press officer found out when he telephoned Paul's St. John's Wood home and was answered by Paul himself that he had been home all day with his black Mini Cooper safely locked up in the garage." And one more brief little point I want to bring up from that article. You notice how they said it happened in January 1967, not November 1966? Yep, November 1966 is the agreed upon date mostly, but some people say it happened in 1967, some people said it happened before Rubber Soul. In late 1967, the group would release Magical Mystery Tour, an EP/album depending on whether you're in England or here in America. For the sake of this video, we're going to focus on the album with the 5 extra tracks. Now, on the legendary track Strawberry Fields Forever, at the end of the song, John says a seemingly number of just unintelligible phrases. That is until you listen a little closer. One of the phrases at the end of the track is said to have said, "I buried Paul." Take a listen. Now, in all honesty, I really don't get this one. I mean, I've listened to the track God knows how many times, and when I hear that line, I always hear a cr sound at the beginning, like he's saying crack. And that's because John would go on record to state he wasn't saying I buried Paul, he was saying cranberry sauce, which, given the song's themes of childhood and nostalgia, makes sense. Take another listen with this context. Moving on to the cover art of the record, and just a heads up, for the images that I have to find online, I am going to use the EP cover art. Just note that the cover art for this and the EP are basically the same, except with the EP it's just this image and not with the extra stuff around it. Now, if you were to flip the cover art for the album, you would allegedly not read Beatles anymore, you would read a phone number. The phone number, allegedly, once again, is 231-7438. Now, it's debated upon what actually happens when you call the phone number. Some of my favorite ones, including a mortician saying you found more clues, or someone saying, "Beware of Abbey Road." But once again, none of these can be confirmed. Lastly, for Magical Mystery Tour, I want to mention the television movie that accompanied the record. Now, the movie itself is crap. So if you want to watch it, keep that in mind. But in the finale of the film where they sing Your Mother Should Know, all three of the Beatles are wearing red roses, except for Paul, who is wearing a black rose. Now, the answer to this one is actually very simple. They ran out of red roses. Moving on to 1968, it was at this point that people seriously began to analyze the lyrics to Beatles records, and it also helps that Sgt. Pepper was one of the first ever pop albums to have its lyrics printed right on the cover, and so the group would begin to play with that in the lyrics to their songs, specifically track 3, Glass Onion, off their 1968 follow-up, simply titled The Beatles, or The White Album. Love this album, by the way, got a original numbered copy of it right here. So, for extra context, Glass Onion is essentially the first ever Troll song. And so, in the lyric, John puts the line, "Here's another clue for you all, the walrus with Paul." Now, John was just doing a little trolling with that line. He wasn't actually being serious. But a lot of people seem to actually pick it up as an actual clue for the theory. John would later go on record to say that was all rubbish and it was just a, quote, piece of poetry. Moving on to track 14 on the album, it is the only one written by Ringo. It's Don't Pass Me By. Now, Don't Pass Me By is just a pleasant little country tune, right? No, this one has legitimately one of the creepiest clues in the whole thing. And just for the record, I don't believe in the Paul is dead conspiracy, but I can't lie, this is honestly weird. So, in the track, Ringo sings the line, "I'm sorry that I doubted you, it was so unfair. You were in a car crash, and you lost your hair." For the longest time, I thought he was saying head, but no, he was saying hair. Now, let's back up on the album a little. Let's take a look at track 10, I'm So Tired. Great track, by the way, one of my favorites off the album. It's about John being very tired, who would have thought? However, at the end of the track, John mutters something strange. "Monsieur, monsieur, how about another one?" Now, it gets strange when you play the track in reverse and you supposedly hear the lines, "Paul is dead, man, miss him, miss him." However, all of that pales in comparison to the second to last track on the album, Revolution 9. Now, if you're not an over-obsessed Beatles maniac like I am, you probably don't know what Revolution 9 is. It is an avant-garde, musique concrète, sound collage art piece that was mostly composed by John and Yoko, with George doing some parts as well. Now, this track is already very creepy on its own. And the clues are so creepy that I think it's time for some creepy lighting. Now, during the part of the track in which gunfire is heard, you can play it in reverse and supposedly hear a car skidding off the road and crashing, and then you allegedly hear the phrase, "Get me out." But the conspiracy goes he got his head cut off, so how is he going to speak? But, of course, the one that everyone goes back to, the one clue that everyone seems to go back to, at least with the White Album, is at the very beginning of the track. You know, where he's saying, "Number 9? Number 9? You can reverse that and you can allegedly hear the phrase, "Turn me on, dead man." Now, in terms of visual clues, at least on the front cover of the record, obviously there's nothing much to go off because, it's the White Album. But included with the vinyl and all subsequent reissues of it, both on vinyl and CD, there was this little poster that came included. Essentially, it was just a collage of various pictures of the group around the time. Now, my copy of the record doesn't have the poster with it, but I do have the 2018 remix CD, and that does include the poster, albeit in a smaller form, so bear with me here. Now, I would first like to direct your attention to this image right here, where we have Paul just laying down in the bathtub. Now, some people say this is William Campbell without his makeup, and if you look closer, you can see, ooh, he's clutching his head, which some people have got that, he's cluing that he lost his head in the crash. Some people are also asking, why is there just a picture of Paul in the bathtub? Mind you, this is the same poster that has Naked John. However, right below Naked John, and I really hope you guys can see this, right here is what appears to be a very young Paul, although he looks kind of off here. And some people says is that this is William before all, the changes to his face and stuff. However, there is a logical explanation in this one. This is actually a picture of Paul in disguise for a holiday in France, because the second he steps out his door, he's going to be hounded by every single person within a 20-mile radius. Now, that's about it for the White Album and for 1968 as a whole. Keep in mind, at this point, the rumor was still very underground. It wasn't mainstream at all. But a year later, that was all about to change with the release of, arguably, the Beatles' magnum opus, Abbey Road.
Morning, Paul.
Good morning, Rich.
How are you this morning?
Now, the thing is, with Abbey Road, lyrically, there's not really much, honestly, there's not really anything to dissect. Some people say there's like one little line and come together that points to it, but it wasn't nearly interesting enough for me to include. But that doesn't really matter. What we're here to focus on is the cover, which is probably the most dissected piece in this whole entire conspiracy. Now, Abbey Road is probably the most iconic album cover, period. I mean, the only albums I can think of that can go toe-to-toe with it, Dark Side of the Moon, maybe Thriller, but this is a legendary album art. And it's just four guys walking down a crosswalk. Simple. Except, this isn't just four guys walking down a crosswalk. This is, in fact, a funeral procession. Let's start with George. You can see he's dressed head to toe in denim. Maybe he's the gravedigger. You have Ringo dressed all in black. Maybe he's the Undertaker. And then you have John dressed all in white. Maybe he's the priest. Lastly, we have Paul walking out of step with all the others, barefoot, and holding a cigarette in his right hand, even though Paul's left-handed. Now, we could disregard the fact that maybe he's holding it in that hand because it just looks better on the album cover, but that's not even where all of this ends. Now, if you look at the Volkswagen Beetle behind George, which, by the way, if you drive a Beetle, stay away from me, you can find a license plate that reads LMW28If, which some people have interpreted as Linda McCartney weeps 28 if Paul had lived. Now, disregard the fact that Linda didn't meet Paul until 68, which would have been 2 years after their crash, but oh well. On September 26, 1969, Abbey Road would be released to the masses, and reviews would be coming in fairly quickly, but it would be one in particular that would drive this from just a small little rumor to a worldwide conspiracy. On September 17, 1969, a student newspaper for Drake University would publish an article essentially going over all the clues that we've been discussing here. The writer of the article, a man by the name of Tim Harper, would later go on record to state, quote, "A lot of us, because of Vietnam and the so-called establishment, were ready, willing, and able to believe just about any sort of conspiracy." October 12, 1969, a progressive rock station by the name of WKNR would, be hosting its regular telephone calls, people calling in, requesting songs and whatnot. That would be until one caller brought up the conspiracy, which then the DJ, a man by the name of Russ Gibb, would begin discussing it for the next couple of hours he was on air. Now, 2 days later, the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily, would post a review of Abbey Road that was very satirical in nature. They called the review, "McCartney Dead, New Evidence Brought to Light." This review in particular is where a lot of the Abbey Road clues come from. Now, I guess back in the 60s, a lot of people didn't know what satire was, so a lot of media companies and, more importantly, radio stations began to pick up the story. WKNR, the one which we mentioned earlier, would air a 2-hour program called The Beatle Plot. Nowadays, it's considered a hoax, a fraud, and the makers tried to say, oh, it's a mockumentary. Yeah, I'm sure it is. But a lot of people actually believed it at the time. The day Paul was dead would become a worldwide sensation would be October 21st, when 2 radio stations, WMCA and WABC, would both air programs on them. Now, keep in mind, these were some of the biggest radio stations in the country. WABC in particular broadcasted in over 38 states. It didn't help that on that exact same day, Paul went off for vacation off at his Scotland farm, which was a very secluded place. This would essentially send radio stations into a frenzy. They were literally flying out DJs over to England. One of these DJs actually managed to meet up with Ringo and did a little interview with him where he said, quote, "If people are gonna believe it, they're gonna believe it. I can only say it's not true." The following week, Paul would be interviewed over at his farm by BBC Radio. He would mention that he used to do an interview a week and that he speculated it was declining media appearances that fueled the flames of the conspiracy. Now, you would think that this would finally clear everything up. No, it continued to escalate. This is where things go from rumors and discussions to straight up harassment. So, for context, something the Beatles would essentially do until the very end they would film these little promotional videos for their latest single, and then they would show it on TV. You know, places like The Ed Sullivan Show, for example. Think of it as like music videos before music videos. This tradition would continue with the legendary track Something, a song that was currently #1 at the time. Now, because of the group currently breaking up, they would all film their parts in the video separately. McCartney would be no exception. It's also important to mention that he wasn't in the right frame of mind at the time because his band was breaking up. So he would become more introverted and would neglect to shave his beard, which is something I probably need to do as well. Well, while they were filming their segment for the video, they were being filmed themselves by CBS News, who had snuck onto their property and started filming them without their knowledge. That's gotta be like one of the most deranged things I've ever heard. Like, you would think that this was some sleazy paparazzi company who would do something like that. No, this was CBS News, one of the big 3 media companies. A few weeks later, he would receive a visit from Life magazine, and I say visit in air quotes because they were not invited at all. They just barged onto his property. Paul was understandably very angry. I want to say he tried to hit the photographer, which I don't blame him, because if people just barged onto my farm with a camera and a microphone just to say, "Hey bro, you dead?" I would be pretty mad too. However, the Life crew would get this incident on film, and McCartney, not wanting any more controversy than he already had, would agree to an interview in exchange for the roll of film. This interview would essentially mark the end of the rumors, with Paul stating, quote, "Perhaps the rumor started because I haven't been much in the press lately. I have done enough press for a lifetime and I don't have anything to say these days. I am happy to be with my family and I will work when I work. I was switched on for 10 years and I have never switched off. Now I'm switching off whenever I can. I would rather be a little less famous these days." The article would be published on November 7th, and the rumor would begin to die down and eventually fade away. But it wouldn't be forgotten. In 1971, on the track How Do You Sleep, which was John's track, is essentially a diss towards McCartney where he states, "Those freaks were right when they said that you were dead." And that's the story of Paul is Dead. Now, the actual rumor itself has really died down these days. It's really not believed by much anymore. In fact, it's been parodied more than actually believed, like this very classic Chris Farley skit.
Okay. You remember when you were with the Beatles and you were supposed to be dead, and there's all these clues that, like, he'd play some song backwards and it'd say, like, Paul is dead, and everyone thought that you were dead or something.
Yep.
That was a hoax, right?
Yeah, I wasn't really dead.
Right.
However, to this day, you can still find believers of Paul is Dead. There are documentaries out there, there are Instagram accounts, and most importantly, there is the YouTube channel Justice for James Paul McCartney, which has over 11,000 subscribers. Now, to be fair, a lot of these subscribers are probably subscribed to them for like a joke because it is considered kind of a lolcow channel in the Beatles community. Obviously, don't go send any harassment or hate their way. It's best to just leave it alone. That is the full story of Paul is Dead. I think from this video we can all deduce that Paul's alive. Shocker, I know. Now, I didn't cover every single clue in this video because, and I'm trying to keep this as PG as possible, they're both. Like, so many of these clues are so nothing and so meaningless, they're so uninteresting and boring that I didn't even feel like covering them. That being said, thank you guys for watching. Peace. help me out. But the conspiracy goes that his head got cut off. Nope.